This program is brought to you by the Reeves Law Firm, www.reevesfirm.com.
In the know. Good evening, everyone. In the know. Tony Reeves, fire. Following the news in any way, shape, or form. No shortage of things to talk about. What does it mean? What will it bring? This is a reality we simply have to accept. Tony Reeves, fire. Tony Reeves. Let's go ahead and get started.
Good day and welcome to another edition of Q&A Social Security Disability Today. Today we're going to talk about understanding the medical vocational guidelines, which is known in the Social Security disability practice as the grids. Now this video may get a little confusing at times, so as you're going back and forth, if you're not totally understanding, if it's not completely clear and so forth, by all means, if you're trying to figure out if this applies to your case, I encourage you to seek out representation to get a better understanding of how the guidelines actively affect your case. All right, here is what I call the blah, blah, blah information. The following rules reflect the major functional vocational patterns which are, and you can all read as you see accordingly. Here's my understanding in terms of what you probably need to know. In the grander scheme of things, the medical vocational guidelines takes in consideration various vocational factors, which means your age, your education, and your work experience, as well as what your residual functional capacity is. Now, for those of you who are like, what the heck is a residual functional capacity, or RFC? Really, what an RFC means is, what are you able to do despite your Social Security, despite your disability? So, remember, you got to think about it kind of in this context. Before you applied for disability benefits, before you became disabled, you were able to do certain things. So now that you have these medical impairments, both mental, physical, or both, the question now becomes that, as with those impairments, what are you capable of doing despite those impairments? That's what they call the RFC. So the idea of the guidelines is that they call it a grid because ultimately what they do is they put these various categories together: the age, your education, your work background, and then your limitation. And what happens is that based on certain sets of circumstances, it directs Social Security to determine whether you are disabled or not. Now this is going to sound kind of wiggy, but the vocational guidelines typically don't kick into gear unless you're 50 and above, or if you're 45 to 49 and you can't speak English at all. But for the most part, if you're between the ages of 18 to 44, the vocational guidelines are not as useful to you. They're usually useful to you once you get over a certain age. But let's talk about those different areas a little bit more. Under the first category is age. Keep in mind, there are basically 4 categories that Social Security looks at. Younger individual, which is 18 to 49, closely approaching advanced age, 50 to 54, advanced age, 55 to 59, and closely approaching retirement age, 60 to 64. Keep in mind this, and I said this on a prior slide, the regulations tends to be more useful in terms of the application of the grids once you hit 50 and above. If you look at the guidelines that they have laid out in the Social Security regulations, at certain limitations in terms of your physical ability to do certain things, depending on how old you are above the age of 50, as well as with your education and your work experience, it may or may not direct a finding of disability. But let's back up to the first thing. Here's what I tell people when people are asking me about the vocational guidelines. I tell them 18 to 45 or 18 to 44, and if you fall into that genre and so forth, the medical vocational guidelines aren't as useful to you. So at that particular point, your focus mainly should be on demonstrating your condition, whether it be exertional or non-exertional, prevents you from doing work. And we'll talk about those things a little bit more detail a little bit later. But just keep in mind this. The vocational guidelines are a little bit more useful if you're 50 and above. The older you get, the more favorable it tends to lean in your favor as it relates to age. So if you're 50 to 54, it's a little bit better for you. If you're 55 to 59, it's a little bit better for you if you're 60 to 64. Like I said, this is kind of confusing, but I hope this makes sense as I'm going through it. So that's the portion as it relates to age. So the next component is the education piece. Sometimes I'm pretty sure you're wondering, why is Social Security so interested in the education, my educational history? Well, the reality is that they want to consider you for purposes of literacy, meaning your ability to read and to write and be able to learn and acquire skills to do certain jobs. When they're looking at the level of your education level, they're looking at basically whether you're illiterate, meaning you're not able to read or write. You have marginal education, which basically is anywhere, sixth grade level or less. 7th through 11th is limited, and then high school and above. The reality is they're looking at it from the standpoint of, if you're educated, they are looking at whether or not, depending on your educational backgrounds, you have the educational capability to acquire the ability to learn jobs. So think about it from this standpoint. For instance, if you had a limited education, they wouldn't assume that you would have the ability to get a job as an attorney. That's not trying to be funny, but in order to have a job as an attorney, you have to have a college degree plus 3 or 4 or 5 years of law school, depending on the school. But if you've only got education between the 7th and 11th grade, that eliminates those jobs. Remember, same thing with age, same thing with education. The key is trying to identify what jobs are available within a certain parameter of information that you're able to do, despite all these various factors, the age, education, work background, as well as your residual functional capacity. We're going to talk about your work history next. All right. Here's the part that you really need to take the time to explain. First of all, Social Security wants to know about the work that you've done in the last 15 years. For their purposes, that's all that's relevant. The reality is that, first of all, they don't want to know about job. If you're in your 40s and your 50s, they don't want to know about the job you did right out of high school. Those aren't relevant because most times those aren't the jobs you're going to be doing anyway. They figure the way the Social Security regs pretty much lay out is that they presume that you would have acquired certain skills specifically identified within a particular period of time. They're looking at it from that 15-year window. Here is what you need to understand. They're trying to determine, did you get anything from doing those jobs that could be used for other jobs? Be careful, because most people do what it's called a composite job. And what do you mean by a composite job? Meaning it's a job that has skills that are attributed to other jobs as well. Think about it. When we see a man who's a receptionist, we think they're just answering the phone. But most times, people who are sitting at the front desk, they're doing other things as well. They may be doing filing work. They may be doing secretarial work. They may be screening calls. They may be doing more what's called the normal job, as it's normally performed or as generally performed in the national economy. They typically are performing it at a different level. So when you're explaining the work that you're doing, you want to be detailed about specific what your responsibilities were, how long you did it, how often you do it. So this way Social Security can have a clear picture of exactly what skills you acquired and whether or not those skills could be used for other things. Now, your residual functional capacity. Here's the thing. Let me kind of stop for a second before I start talking about this. All the other things you really don't have a whole lot of control over. Don't have a control over your age. Your education is your education. Your work experience, your work experiences. Your residual functional capacity is the thing that you really want to make sure you nail down appropriately. Meaning, this is what you're telling Social Security you're capable of doing despite your medical condition. So whether it's a bad back, bad knees, high blood pressure, high blood sugar, whatever the case may be, what the residual functional capacity is how these limitations affects you, and most importantly, what can you do despite your limitations. I know I've talked about the grids a bit here, and you're probably saying, but I'm just so confused. You still haven't really got to the meat of the matter. Let me just get to the meat of the matter of this. The medical vocational guidelines utilizes your age, education, your work background, along with your RFC to determine whether or not, under certain circumstances, the Social Security can make the determination that you are disabled if you meet certain criteria. Meaning, the vocational guidelines are broken down into various charts. There's a chart for sedentary work, a chart for light work, a chart for medium work, and so forth. The idea is if you have certain information that fits neatly into specific categories, then in some instances it may direct at finding a disabled. In some instances it directs at finding a disabled. If not disabled. Keep in mind, and I've said this before, the medical vocational guidelines are typically not as useful to you if you are young. So if you're sitting here saying, well, do I meet the guidelines? The guidelines are not going to probably, I don't say definitely, but probably not going to help you if you're between the ages of 18 to 44. 45 to 49, only if you are unable to speak English. 50 and above is where they start finding, where the guidelines tends to be more useful. And so let's kind of hit some of those little things really quick. The less educated you are, the more beneficial towards demonstrating what you're capable of. I always tell people, this is going to sound jacked up. The older you are, the more favorable it is to you. The less education you have, the more favorable it is to you. The fewer skills you have, the more favorable it is to you. So the reality is the vocational guidelines, or if it's like two extremes, the fewer skills or no skills are helpful to you, or if you have skills, you are so skilled that those skills can only be used in those particular fields. Those two things tend to be helpful to you. Everything else kind of falls in the middle here. Okay, but when we talk about limitations, a lot of times what happens is that if the grids apply to you in such a way where they dictate that you're not disabled, you have to now ask yourself the question, are your limitations specifically exertional or non-exertional or both? Exertional typically means your strength demands. So let's say you had a bad back, and that bad back caused you to have difficulty sitting, and that bad back can give you difficulty standing, lifting, pushing, pulling. Those are exertional limitations. Non-exertional are those things that are other than strength demands. So like for instance, let's say migraines. So let's say for instance, having to go to the bathroom on a regular basis, pain, fatigue, missing days because of anxiety and issues, or having to be locked in your room because you can't deal with the public. All of these things are things that Social Security needs to take into consideration for purposes of determining what your specific limitations are. Let me go ahead and go on the record saying that this is probably one of the more confusing videos that I've done. And I know that some of you are probably going, okay, Attorney Reeves, you've done better on other videos than this one right here. This is still confusing. The reason why it's confusing is because it's confusing because the medical vocational guidelines aren't as clean as you think. A lot of times there are variables that come into play. Like I've had clients who have the grids didn't apply to them when they were younger, but then the moment they hit a certain age, they're 50 or so forth, now the grid applies. Or they started when they were in their 50s, and then they transitioned from 50 to 54 to 55 to 59. So certain circumstances where at 50 to 54, we had to demonstrate that they could only do sedentary work, but now they're 55, we had to demonstrate they could do light work because the regulations were more favorable for them at 55 than it was at 54. So then you're also talking about work. You're looking at, okay, the person did this job. How long did they do it? Did they get any skills from that job that could be applied to other ones? Did they stay at the job long enough? What kind of education did they have? All of those things are factors that come into play. And then the same thing with exertional or non-exertional. Somebody comes to me and they say they have a bad back. I'm going to ask, do you experience pain? How often does the pain bother you? Does it affect your ability to concentrate? Does it affect your ability to basically maintain pace in terms of doing the things you're doing? Can you are you able to focus when you have spikes of pain? One of the things I tell people is that the law may say something, but it's the facts that rule the day. And everybody's case is on a fact-by-fact basis. And I say this to all of you who are watching this video, to not get into your mind that you can take your facts and pigeonhole them into a certain circumstance so you can say, this shows that I'm disabled. Because guess what? It may not be that clear-cut. There may be some other things. And the other thing is, if it points a direction towards you being found not disabled, you're going to want to know whether or not there are other things in here that Social Security needs to take in consideration. So I say this to say this. When you're looking at your case and you're thinking that maybe the medical vocational guidelines or the grids apply to you, but you're not totally sure, don't sit here and try to figure it out on your own. Take the opportunity, get some help, because at the end of the day, this is your case. You have to prove you're disabled. Do everything you can do to put your case in the best light so the Social Security is not trying to figure out if you're disabled or not.